Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very strange, the medieval mindset that still quietly runs our life. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's slightly ridiculous journey together. You probably think the 9-to-5 schedule came from the Industrial Revolution, from clever Victorian men in waistcoats calculating the perfect number of working hours before employees started dying. But no, it came from monks. Back in the Middle Ages, monks were the only people organised enough to tell time, and irritating enough to make everyone else follow it. Their lives ran on a sacred, endless loop of bells. Morning bells, midday bells, bells for prayer, bells for eating, bells for regretting that you became a monk. It was less a spiritual journey and more a divine alarm system with extra guilt. The day was divided into what they called canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, which sounds less like prayer times and more like rejected Harry Potter spells. At every interval, monks would stop whatever they were doing to chant, kneel, or stare blankly into eternity. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about obedience. You weren't supposed to think. You were supposed to synchronize with God, the abbey, and whoever was in charge of the bell tower. And yes, there was always that monk who rang it 2 minutes early just to watch the world burn. Then, over the centuries, the world outside caught the contagion. Towns scheduled their markets by church bells. Guilds used them to mark work hours. And eventually factories copied the system wholesale, minus the praying, plus screaming managers. When the Industrial Revolution rolled in, someone basically said, let's take the monastic routine, remove the faith, and add paperwork. And thus, the modern workday was born. The monks at least got silence, wine, and a robe that doubled as pyjamas. You get fluorescent lights and Slack notifications. Even your lunch break has roots in monastic timekeeping. The sext hour, when monks pause to pray and maybe sneak in a snack before continuing their divine spreadsheets. So next time your alarm goes off at 7 a.m. and you drag yourself toward another day of labour in exchange for rent and mild back pain, remember, you're not modern. You're medieval, just without the chanting or the forgiveness. The 9-to-5 didn't evolve. It escaped the monastery, put on a suit, and learned to say, let's circle back on that. If you've ever sneezed in public and someone muttered, bless you, congratulations. You've just participated in one of humanity's oldest and dumbest reflexes. It's not politeness. It's medieval panic that never got the memo about germ theory. Back in the 6th century, when the plague was having its European world tour, sneezing was not a mild inconvenience. It was a bad omen. If you sneezed once, people assumed you were infected. If you sneezed twice, they started dividing your possessions. The logic was simple. When you sneezed, your soul tried to escape through your nose. The devil, apparently lurking nearby, might seize the opportunity to snatch it mid-air. Enter Pope Gregory the Great, who in 590 CE decided that every sneeze needed divine intervention. He ordered the faithful to respond with, God bless you, effectively turning respiratory function into a team sport. Every bless you was an emergency prayer, a miniature exorcism for people with hay fever. The phrase spread faster than the plague itself. Soon, every village in Europe was collectively blessing each other into exhaustion. Nobody could sneeze in peace. Imagine the soundscape: church bells, roosters, and 40 villagers shouting, God bless you, every time someone inhaled pollen. And it worked. Not medically, but socially. Saying bless you became a way of proving you weren't the kind of monster who'd let your neighbour die unblessed. Refusing to say it was basically witchcraft. The superstition stuck. Even after centuries of science, hygiene, and vaccines, we still bless people who sneeze like it's 1348. No one believes their soul's escaping anymore, but we still panic at the sound of nasal explosions. Meanwhile, the only thing truly escaping during a sneeze is 100,000 droplets of bacteria at 100 miles per hour, directly into your face. And nobody blesses you for that. So next time someone sneezes and you instinctively mumble, "Bless you," just know you're reenacting a medieval ritual invented to keep Satan out of someone's sinuses. You're not being polite. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old mass delusion. And somehow, it's still considered good manners. The next time you twirl spaghetti or politely stab a piece of chicken, remember, in medieval Europe, that simple act would have gotten you labelled as a heretic. Yes, the fork, that harmless little utensil in your cutlery drawer, was once considered a tool of Satan. It arrived in Western Europe around the 11th century, carried by wealthy Byzantine nobles who used small, golden versions to eat dainty bites of food without getting their hands dirty. Logical, right? Wrong. The church immediately had a meltdown. Clergymen declared that using a fork was an insult to God, because, according to them, the Almighty had already provided the perfect eating tools, fingers. The idea that someone might prefer metal over flesh apparently bordered on blasphemy. One famous case involved a Byzantine princess who married into the Venetian royal family. She brought her gold forks with her, and the local priests lost their collective minds. When she died of the plague shortly after, the clergy smugly declared that her death was divine punishment for daring to use a shiny pronged stick instead of her God-given digits. For centuries, Europeans continued to eat with their hands like cavemen in fancy clothes. Even Renaissance nobles hesitated to use forks because it seemed unnatural. Knives and spoons were fine. One stabbed, one scooped, both biblical enough. But the fork? The fork had vibes. Ironically, people also started dying of foodborne illness because, shockingly, dirty fingers aren't hygienic. But no amount of dysentery could out-argue the church's logic. God made hands. Ergo, use them. It wasn't until the 17th century, when Italy's fashionable elite decided forks were elegant, that the rest of Europe caved. And as always, the English joined last, declaring forks effeminate until someone important used one in public. So, next time you sit at a table and politely twirl your pasta, know this. You're performing an act that was once seen as morally questionable. The medieval church fought against sanitation, elegance, and table decorum, and lost. Which, in a poetic way, makes every dinner with cutlery a tiny victory for common sense over organised superstition. Or, as the priests would have called it, temptation served in silver. If you think bachelor parties today are chaotic, imagine them with swords. In the Middle Ages, before marriage was about love or shared Netflix accounts, it was a financial transaction. But even back then, men couldn't resist having one last night of poor decisions before signing their lives away. Thus was born the medieval stag night, the original bachelor party. Knights would gather in taverns or manors, drink ale until their helmets didn't fit, gamble away their horses, and loudly declare eternal loyalty to freedom, which usually lasted about 8 hours. These celebrations were supposed to honour the groom's transition into responsibility. In practice, they were an excuse to see how much mead a man could consume before falling into a moat. The stag symbolised virility and wildness, which is medieval for drunken regret. Guests would toast the groom's bravery for entering matrimony, while quietly taking bets on how long he'd survive domestic life. Someone would inevitably challenge someone else to a duel, and at least one man would mistake the bride's cousin for a barmaid. The church hated these parties, of course. Priests called them feasts of sin, which, to be fair, was accurate. They warned that drunkenness before marriage led to damnation. The knights, naturally, took this as a challenge. Over time, the tradition trickled down from nobles to townsmen, who replaced castles with taverns and armour with leather shoes. But the spirit remained. Eat, drink, and behave terribly, because tomorrow you're legally obligated not to. Even the morning after rituals were familiar. There were hangovers, awkward silences, and promises never to speak of what happened. The only real difference between then and now is that medieval men didn't have smartphones to record the evidence. So when you see a modern groom stumbling out of a bar wearing a plastic crown and regret, you're witnessing history. It's the same tradition, just without the swords, the plague, and the moral authority of a guy named Sir Geoffrey trying to juggle flaming torches while yelling, "For love!" Bachelor parties didn't evolve. They just downgraded from chainmail to matching t-shirts. And somewhere, a medieval monk is still praying for all of them. When someone dies today, we instinctively dress in black. It feels respectful, somber, even timeless. But the truth is, it's just a medieval fashion trend that got wildly out of hand. The colour of mourning used to depend on geography. The Romans wore white to funerals, clean, symbolic, and excellent for reflecting heat, while you mourned under the Italian sun. But medieval Europe looked at that and said, "No. Let's make grief depressing and stylish." Black dye was expensive in the Middle Ages, which meant only the wealthy could afford to look properly devastated. Peasants, of course, couldn't afford sorrow in fabric form, so they wore whatever was clean, which, statistically, was nothing. The nobles, however, made mourning an event. Draped in black wool and veils, they wailed theatrically through the streets, because grief, like everything else, had to be performative. The church loved it. Black symbolized humility before God, and conveniently, it made the clergy's wardrobe choices look pious instead of lazy. Over time, the colour of mourning spread to every social class, because nothing says repentance like wearing something that absorbs both heat and despair. By the 14th century, black funerals were the ultimate power move. Kings died in black. Widows lived in black. Entire courts spent years in coordinated sadness. Queen Victoria later revived the custom centuries later by staying in mourning black for 40 years, a record-breaking emotional hostage situation. Of course, the colour eventually lost its religious meaning and just stuck. Now, we all show up to funerals dressed like accountants who misfiled eternity, because the Middle Ages decided grief needed a dress code. Ironically, the rest of the world didn't follow. In much of Asia, mourners still wear white, the colour of purity. In Africa, bright colours symbolise a life well lived. Meanwhile, in the West, we prefer to look like a collective tax audit for the dead. So next time you attend a funeral in black, remember, you're not channeling timeless reverence. You're just following a 1,000-year-old medieval fashion rule invented by rich people trying to look holy. And, as with all fashion trends, it's never really been about the dead. It's about proving you cared more stylishly than everyone else. Ah, the handshake. That sacred gesture of modern civility, professionalism, and the occasional bacterial exchange. It seems polite, friendly, even human. But its origins are, like most medieval customs, deeply suspicious. In the Middle Ages, people didn't shake hands to say hello. They did it to say, "Please don't murder me." Medieval Europe was a paranoid place. Everyone carried weapons, everyone owed someone else a debt, and everyone's cousin was plotting a coup. So when two men met, they'd extend their right hands to prove they weren't holding a dagger. The shaking part came later, a little theatrical jiggle to make sure no knife was hiding up the sleeve. It was less a greeting and more a mutual weapons inspection. Knights, merchants, and even kings used it, though usually with a sword hand, trembling from the effort of pretending to trust someone. And of course the left-handed minority, eternally suspicious, were considered untrustworthy simply because their sword was on the other side. Medieval logic, flawless as always. By the 16th century, it evolved into a formal greeting among gentlemen, replacing bows and the ever-popular, awkward silence. It became a sign of equality, a way of saying, we are both free men, capable of stabbing each other, but choosing not to. Fast forward a few centuries, and the handshake somehow became professional. Businessmen turned it from a survival tactic into a networking ritual. The same gesture once used to ensure neither party was hiding a blade now seals multi-million-dollar deals, which, let's be honest, are just the modern version of duels, only slower and with lawyers. Even the pandemic couldn't kill it. Doctors warned us to stop shaking hands, and humanity collectively said, No, we'd rather risk plague than look rude. A very medieval mindset, really. So the next time someone grips your hand too tightly at a meeting, remember what they're really saying. I come in peace. For now. The handshake isn't a symbol of trust. It's a fossil from an age when trust could get you stabbed. And given how business still works, maybe it hasn't changed that much after all. If you've ever been told to chew with your mouth closed, don't talk while eating, or stop licking the knife. Congratulations. You're practicing ancient survival techniques invented by medieval people who were tired of dying from dinner. See, table manners didn't start because someone wanted to appear elegant. They started because medieval dining was horrifying. Picture a long wooden table covered in greasy trenchers, basically edible plates made of stale bread, with everyone using the same knife, the same bowl, and the same fingers. You didn't have your own utensils. You had hope. There were no napkins either. The standard etiquette was to wipe your hands on the nearest dog or neighbour. Monks complained about guests wiping their greasy fingers on scripture. And yes, there were rules against spitting on the table, which implies someone had to invent that rule the hard way. By the 13th century, disgust finally evolved into etiquette. Manuals began circulating. Books like The Book of the Civilized Man, which taught you not to scratch yourself while eating, blow your nose in the tablecloth, or examine your teeth with the knife. These were actual instructions, meaning they weren't obvious at the time. The upper class quickly turned hygiene into hierarchy. Peasants could eat with their hands, but nobles used manners to prove superiority, a sort of social fencing match using spoons instead of swords. Eventually, manners became moral. The church decided that proper behaviour at the table reflected a clean soul, because nothing says holiness like daintily slurping soup while believing in witchcraft. By the Renaissance, dining had turned from survival to performance. Banquets were less about eating and more about demonstrating that you weren't a barbarian. It was Instagram culture, but with trenchers. And yet, those same medieval rules are still with us. Don't burp, don't pick, don't shout. You're not doing them to look polite. You're doing them because, in another timeline, not doing them could have gotten you dysentery. You probably think the weekend was a modern invention, a triumph of labour unions, productivity science, or enlightened bosses who valued rest. Nope, it was invented by medieval peasants who wanted to stop working long enough to drink, pray, and occasionally remember what sunlight looked like. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of a weekend. You worked until your body broke, then you worked slightly more. But the Church, in its infinite mercy, decided people should occasionally rest, not for health, of course, but to attend Mass and avoid sinning unsupervised. The church calendar was packed with feast days, sometimes up to 100 per year. These were religious holidays honouring obscure saints, the Virgin Mary, and occasionally events that sounded suspiciously like excuses for parties. Each feast day meant a day off work, free food, and the legal right to drink before noon. The nobility complained that peasants had too many holidays. One medieval bishop famously grumbled that the people work 1 day and rest 3. It's possibly the first recorded instance of a manager complaining about employee productivity. As the centuries passed, the Reformation trimmed the fat, literally cancelling dozens of saint days for being too fun. The Puritans, in particular, were horrified that people enjoyed resting, so they pushed for a stricter system. 1 mandatory day of rest, Sunday, which is how the Lord's Day slowly turned into your modern lazy day. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Factory owners noticed that overworked, miserable labourers kept breaking things, including themselves, so they reluctantly reintroduced rest days. Saturday afternoons were added later when someone realised workers who weren't exhausted made fewer accidents, like falling into machinery. By the 20th century, the 2-day weekend had become official. 1 day for God, 1 day for hangovers. So the next time you collapse into bed on a Saturday night, remember, you're enjoying a tradition born from medieval religion, refined by Protestant guilt, and perfected by capitalism's need to make you love Monday again. The weekend wasn't given to humanity out of kindness. It was a holy compromise between sin, survival, and scheduling. And somehow, we're still thanking God for it. When you slide on a wedding ring today, you're not just declaring eternal love, you're reenacting a medieval property exchange. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It was an economic transaction with decorative vows. Love came after the paperwork, usually followed by regret and joint land management. The ring wasn't a symbol of devotion, it was a receipt. The origin of the ring goes way back to ancient Egypt, where circular bands symbolized eternity. The idea travelled through Rome, where men gave rings to women as proof of ownership. By the time it reached medieval Europe, the church realized this was excellent PR, a symbol of faithfulness that doubled as a legal shackle. The ring was placed on the fourth finger of the left hand because people believed a vein of love, the vena amoris, ran directly to the heart. This was complete nonsense. Medieval science also thought headaches came from demons and that leeches had medical degrees. But the myth stuck, mostly because it sounded poetic enough to justify the expense of gold. Weddings themselves were barely religious until the church got involved. Before that, it was common law. You said, "I do," in front of witnesses, shook hands, and boom, legally married. The church saw a business opportunity. Soon, only unions blessed by clergy were valid, and rings became mandatory props. And don't be fooled. Those early rings were rarely worn by men. For centuries, the ring was a one-way symbol, a woman's visible sign of possession, not partnership. Husbands didn't start wearing them until the 20th century, when World War II soldiers began sporting rings to remember their wives, or remind everyone they were taken, even overseas. Now, the wedding ring is everywhere. A tiny halo of metal that supposedly represents love, trust, and eternity, until someone forgets it on the bathroom sink. So when you glance at that band of gold, remember what it really means. Not eternal romance, not divine blessing. It's a medieval merger agreement that survived every cultural collapse since the Crusades. You're not wearing a symbol of love. You're wearing a 900-year-old contract with better branding. In the Middle Ages, the average person's home made a modern studio apartment look like Versailles. Walls? Optional. Doors? Overrated. Privacy? A myth. Most people lived in single-room houses shared with family, animals, and whatever spirits were haunting the rafters. The medieval idea of personal space was, please stop stepping on the chicken. But then came fabric, that miraculous technology that could hide things without building new walls. Curtains started as practical objects, heavy drapes to keep out drafts, flies, and nosy neighbours. But soon they evolved into social statements. Nobles began hanging thick embroidered curtains around their beds, not just for warmth, but for dignity. These bed hangings were like portable bedrooms, creating the illusion of privacy in a hall filled with servants, snoring relatives, and the occasional bard. If you were wealthy enough, your bed had curtains so grand they could double as stage sets. Some even had inner curtains, privacy from your own spouse, apparently. Guests slept in the same room, sometimes the same bed, so if you wanted to change clothes, pray, or cry dramatically, curtains were your only line of defence. Peasants caught on eventually, using whatever rags they could find to partition their homes. Hanging a blanket between you and the pigsty suddenly felt luxurious. Curtains became the medieval equivalent of noise-cancelling headphones, mostly symbolic, mildly effective. Over time, the concept spread. Privacy became a social aspiration. By the Renaissance, curtains were everywhere, on beds, walls, windows, and egos. The wealthier you were, the thicker your drapes, and centuries later we still do it. We draw our curtains at night as if we're hiding from the Inquisition, not the neighbour's porch light. We buy blackout curtains, thermal curtains, and privacy shears. Proof that we've upgraded the fabric, but not the paranoia. So next time you close your curtains before bed, remember, you're reenacting a medieval ritual to protect yourself from judgment, gossip, and cold air. The only real difference is that your neighbours probably aren't watching. Probably. When you hear "God Save the King," you probably think of national pride, a dignified anthem sung by loyal citizens. But in the Middle Ages it wasn't about patriotism at all. It was an exorcism. The phrase began as a protective prayer, a kind of spiritual insurance policy for monarchs who had the life expectancy of a ham sandwich at a jousting tournament. Medieval people firmly believed kings were chosen by God, but also that Satan had terrible boundary issues. Every rebellion, plague, or bad harvest was blamed on demonic interference. So, "God Save the King" wasn't a cheer. It was crisis management. Whenever a ruler fell ill or someone sneezed near the throne, the church organised public prayers to keep evil away. Entire crowds would chant, "God Save the King," like it was a magic spell, because in their minds, it was. The logic went something like this. If enough peasants yelled the phrase loudly enough, God might hear over the screams of the dying. It worked exactly as well as you'd expect. Medieval kings still died, mostly from poisoning, warfare, or other kings. But people kept chanting, because superstition is the one political tradition humanity never reforms. By the 16th century, the phrase became ceremonial. It appeared in church services, royal processions, and desperate attempts to look loyal. Saying it out loud proved you weren't plotting treason, or at least not today. In a time when bad-mouthing the crown could get you executed, "God Save the King" was less about faith and more about self-preservation. The song version came much later, during the 18th century, when England turned this medieval emergency chant into a national anthem. What began as "Please don't let the devil kill our monarch" became "Please don't let France do it instead." And here we are centuries later, still singing it, hands on hearts, pretending it's about unity, when historically it was just crowdsourced holy water. So the next time you hear a stadium full of people belting "God Save the King," remember, you're witnessing a medieval ghost ritual. Only now it's televised. The idea of a day of rest sounds humane, maybe even progressive. But the medieval church didn't invent it to protect your work-life balance. They invented it to make sure you didn't skip Mass. In early medieval Europe, the church ran everything: your calendar, your conscience, and, if necessary, your afterlife. So they declared Sunday a sacred rest day, not because peasants needed a break, but because priests needed an audience. If you were caught working on a Sunday, you weren't breaking labour law, you were offending God. This wasn't a minor HR infraction, it was eternal damnation. Imagine explaining that in confession. "Forgive me, Father, for I weeded my garden during Vespers." The rule was clear: no ploughing, no weaving, no blacksmithing, and definitely no selling things. Unless, of course, the church wanted to sell indulgences. That was fine. Miraculously fine. Sermons warned that anyone who ignored the Lord's Day risked divine punishment. And because medieval Europe adored horror stories, there were plenty. One legend told of a man who tried baking bread on a Sunday. The dough turned into snakes. Another farmer sharpened his scythe and promptly dropped dead. The moral: God had opinions on your weekend hobbies. Naturally, enforcement was inconsistent. Lords and nobles still worked when they wanted, because divine law, much like modern policy, didn't apply to management. The peasants, meanwhile, were threatened with hell for trying to survive. When the industrial age arrived, people rediscovered the Sunday rule and rebranded it as family time. Employers called it moral, workers called it barely enough. And despite 1,000 years of progress, the logic stayed medieval. You rest, not because you deserve to, but because someone holier, richer, or louder said so. Today, most of us spend Sundays resting by doing unpaid labour, laundry errands and worrying about Monday. It's not quite holy, but it's traditional. So next time you feel guilty for checking email on a Sunday, relax. You're not defying God. You're just honouring the medieval legacy of working when you're technically not supposed to. And if your boss emails you about it, tell them your dough just turned into snakes. When someone calls you sir or ma'am, it feels polite, respectful even. But in the Middle Ages, those words didn't mean "I respect you." They meant I recognize you could legally have me executed. Titles of address were the linguistic armor of feudal Europe. Society was basically a human pyramid with kings at the top, peasants at the bottom, and everyone else crushed somewhere in between. Calling someone sir, short for sire, from the old French seigneur, was how you acknowledged that they owned your land, your livelihood, and possibly your spine. It wasn't optional either. If you met a noble and forgot to bow or failed to use their title, it wasn't a social faux pas, it was a crime. Etiquette manuals from the 14th century actually warned that a man of low estate must speak to his betters with reverence under pain of correction. Correction, of course, being medieval for public humiliation and light beating. Women had their own version, madam, short for madame, literally meaning my lady. That wasn't affection. It was ownership language. It told everyone that this woman belonged to a social class above yours, usually because she belonged to an actual man above yours. Over time, the titles softened. The nobles lost their fiefdoms, and sir and ma'am trickled down the hierarchy until they became meaningless courtesies. Today, we use them for cashiers, customers, and people who block the grocery aisle. Small verbal nods to a social order that technically doesn't exist anymore, but emotionally still does. Americans use them to sound polite. The British use them to sound superior. And in the South, sir and ma'am can mean anything from genuine respect to the verbal equivalent of a slap, depending on tone. It's linguistic evolution in action, feudal submission repackaged as customer service. So the next time someone calls you sir or ma'am, remember, you've just been addressed like a medieval landlord. You didn't earn authority, you inherited vocabulary. And when you say it to someone else, you're not being polite. You're just reenacting feudalism, with better manners and worse tips. If you've ever waited in line for a permit, signed a form that needed 3 other signatures, or emailed someone just circling back, you owe that experience to the Middle Ages. Bureaucracy, humanity's favourite way to look organised while doing absolutely nothing, was a medieval invention. Back then, kings couldn't run kingdoms alone. They needed literate people who could write down who owed taxes, who owned land, and who had been executed recently. Thus, the first clerks appeared, men in robes with quills, ink, and a supernatural ability to make small problems take forever. The Church perfected it. Every tithe, sin, confession, and miracle had to be recorded, stamped, and filed in triplicate. Medieval monasteries were the original offices, candle-lit cubicles filled with unpaid interns called novices. Their handwriting was exquisite, their morale was not. By the 12th century, royal administrations joined in. England's kings employed armies of scribes to record every cow, fence, and human soul in the realm. The result was the Domesday Book, history's first database, though slightly less searchable. It was meant to organise the kingdom. It mostly organised confusion. Soon, every government in Europe copied the idea. If something existed, it needed a form. Property disputes spawned scrolls longer than marriages. Births, deaths, and taxes all required signatures, seals, and witnesses. Losing your paperwork was practically treason. The real genius of medieval bureaucracy was its ability to create work for itself. For every law, you needed a record. For every record, a clerk. For every clerk, another clerk to check the first one's handwriting. It was a perfect self-sustaining ecosystem, a paper-based perpetual motion machine powered entirely by frustration. Fast forward to the modern world, and nothing has changed. We've swapped parchment for PDFs, quills for keyboards, and seals for email signatures, but the spirit remains. You still need permission to do things no one actually understands. So next time you're stuck on hold, or filling out a form that asks for the same information 5 times, take comfort in knowing you're part of a 1,000-year-old tradition. Medieval kings had scrolls. You have spreadsheets. Both are equally meaningless, but at least yours has a submit button. If you think outrage culture was invented on Twitter, you clearly haven't met a medieval villager with spare time and access to a church bell. The Middle Ages ran entirely on moral panic. There was no news cycle, no trending tab, just priests' rumours, and the occasional goat acting suspiciously. One person saw a comet, another blamed the local widow for it, and suddenly half the town was on fire. Back then, society didn't need proof. It needed someone to blame. Drought, witches, illness, witches. Bread didn't rise, definitely witches. It was a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything that went wrong. And if no witches were available, heretics or foreigners would do nicely. The church fueled this with industrial efficiency. Panic was good for attendance. If you could convince people that sin caused plagues and heresy caused earthquakes, they'd tithe more. Call it medieval crowdfunding for divine protection. Inquisitors travelled from town to town, purging corruption, which mostly meant asking leading questions until someone confessed to dancing with the devil. Public hysteria was entertainment too. Witch trials were community events. People brought snacks. The same folks who cheered at executions would spend the next morning praying for mercy. A perfect balance of guilt and spectacle. And let's be honest, not much has changed. We just replaced the gallows with comment sections and the torches with Wi-Fi. Someone makes a mistake, everyone piles on, and by sunset, there's digital shouting, moral superiority, and no actual solutions. The same rhythm, just with better spelling. Medieval panic kept order through fear. Modern panic keeps engagement through algorithms. Both make you feel righteous while achieving nothing. It's a tradition so resilient it survived plagues, printing presses, and the Enlightenment, and still thrives every time someone says, "I can't believe you'd post that." Renaissance Rome was meant to be the beating heart of holiness, a city where saints prayed, pilgrims wept, and divine light bathed every corner. But if you peeled back the gilded facade of marble and fresco, you'd find something entirely different, a place where desire ruled as powerfully as faith. The same bells that called the faithful to Mass also tolled over a city drunk on its own vices. By the early 1500s, the Holy City was a paradox. Pilgrims arrived seeking salvation, yet the streets reeked of perfume and wine. The taverns around Piazza Navona were full of priests who had clearly forgotten their vows of chastity, and possibly sobriety. Noblemen strutted in velvet doublets, while courtesans leaned from their balconies, laughing as the church bells rang. Even confession, meant to cleanse the soul, became an erotic ritual whispered behind latticed screens. Everywhere you looked, temptation was sponsored by the very institutions meant to suppress it. Monks dabbled in alchemy and spent more time brewing aphrodisiacal potions than copying scripture. Nuns exchanged love letters hidden in the pages of psalters. Bishops hosted banquets that would make the pagan emperors blush, complete with roasted peacock, dancing girls, and wine that never seemed to stop flowing. And at the centre of it all stood the Vatican itself, the fortress of morality, or so it claimed. The papal palace was draped in virtue by day, but at night its corridors flickered with candlelight and laughter. Servants swore they saw mistresses slip through secret doors, and rumours spread of cardinals fathering more children than they could count. Rome, the city of saints, had turned itself into a Renaissance version of Las Vegas, if Las Vegas charged indulgences and quoted scripture while doing it. Yet, no one seemed truly scandalized. Hypocrisy had become an art form. A priest might preach about lust in the morning, visit his mistress in the afternoon, and commission a painting of the Virgin Mary that suspiciously resembled her by evening. It was an age where holiness was worn like jewellery, sparkling in the light, tarnished in the dark. Rome called itself the Eternal City, but I. At the peak of the Renaissance, the Vatican was less a monastery and more a royal court, complete with drama, ego, and scandal worthy of a soap opera. The Pope wasn't just God's representative on earth. He was often the richest, most powerful man in Italy, and sometimes the most corrupt. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the reigns of the so-called papal playboys, men who mixed sacred duty with personal pleasure as easily as wine with water. Take Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name became synonymous with sin wrapped in silk. He fathered at least 8 children, officially. Unofficially, well, Rome lost count. His mistress, the beautiful Vanozza dei Catane, lived openly in a palazzo near the Vatican, while his other lover, Giulia Farnese, was called the Pope's concubine by half of Europe. And while he preached virtue, his son Cesare Borgia carved a trail of blood across Italy, and his daughter Lucrezia was whispered to poison her lovers at banquets. The Borgias didn't hide their vices. They flaunted them in velvet robes embroidered with the family crest. But Alexander wasn't alone in his spiritual flexibility. Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, spent more time wearing armour than vestments, leading armies instead of prayers. He was known to swear like a soldier and commission art like a king. Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel were, ironically, funded by a pontiff who had fathered at least one illegitimate daughter. Meanwhile, Pope Leo X from the Medici family treated the papacy like a Florentine bank account, throwing parties so lavish that even Roman nobles blushed. For these men, indulgences weren't just a church doctrine, they were a lifestyle. Their banquets mixed cardinals, courtesans, poets and painters, all swimming in gold and gossip. The Vatican treasury was drained not by crusades, but by carnival masks and mistresses. And yet, the faithful kept donating, believing the Pope to be the moral anchor of the world. Rome's streets knew better. When a new Pope was elected, the people didn't ask for his holiness. They bet on his lovers. The church had become a theatre of sin dressed in silk and incense. Behind every holy decree lay a heartbeat, lusty, ambitious, and entirely human. If the popes were the kings of sin, then the courtesans of Rome were its queens. They were not the back-alley kind, but the glittering elite, the so-called cortigiane oneste, honest courtesans. Honest, of course, in the same way a wolf is honest about wanting sheep. These women could quote scripture in one breath and recite Ovid in the next, wearing gowns that could bankrupt a cardinal and jewellery that probably already had. One of the most infamous was Imperia Cognati, known simply as La Divina Imperia. Her name alone struck awe and fear in noblemen. She entertained cardinals, artists and ambassadors in salons perfumed with incense and scandal. She wasn't just a beauty, she was an intellectual, a woman who could dismantle a bishop's argument about virtue while sipping Venetian wine. When she died, the city mourned her as if she were royalty. Even the clergy sent flowers, pretending it was out of Christian charity rather than fond memory. Then came Tullia d'Aragona, poet, philosopher, and rumoured lover of half the Vatican secretaries. Tullia wrote essays defending women's right to pleasure, something that made priests choke on their communion wafers. Her home became a gathering place for artists and thinkers, where discussions about theology somehow always circled back to the topic of lust. These women navigated the dangerous game of Roman society like seasoned diplomats. In a city ruled by men who preached purity but practiced indulgence, courtesans became the most cunning players. They knew every secret, every affair, and every whispered promise made in candle-lit confessionals. A well-placed word from a courtesan could ruin a career or ignite a papal feud. And they weren't just tolerated, they were necessary. When diplomacy failed, Rome sent not soldiers, but smiles. Noble women lived under surveillance, but courtesans moved freely, their charms serving as unofficial ambassadors. Behind their painted lips and jewelled corsets, they held the true intelligence network of the Renaissance. Ironically, these sinners often showed more wit and dignity than their supposed moral superiors. They played the system that oppressed them and turned it into an art. While priests chased them in secret and poets immortalized them in verse, the courtesans of Rome proved that power didn't always wear a mitre. It sometimes wore a veil of silk. While priests and popes made headlines with their excesses, noblewomen of Renaissance Rome cultivated their own brand of scandal, one far more discreet but no less daring. These women lived in marble palaces gilded with virtue, yet their hearts and letters burned with passion. Marriage in their world was a political contract, not a romantic union. So, When a duchess found herself chained to a dull husband twice her age, the natural solution was a confessor, one who listened very carefully and on occasion stayed the night. Among the whispered legends was Vittoria Colonna, celebrated poet and widow of a nobleman who died on the battlefield. Her piety made her a darling of Rome's religious circles, yet her friendship with Michelangelo raised eyebrows that never truly lowered. Their correspondence, filled with spiritual longing and poetic tenderness, walked the razor's edge between divine love and forbidden desire. The Church called it Platonic. Rome called it obvious. Others were far less subtle. The Orsini and Farnese women, names that carried weight equal to the popes, used their beauty and influence to entangle cardinals, artists, and ambassadors alike. Their salons became theatres of flirtation, where poetry, music, and philosophy were simply pretexts for seduction. Affairs were conducted with coded letters, saintly portraits that concealed miniature love notes, and the occasional pilgrimage that conveniently led to a lover's villa outside the city walls. But discretion was survival. If a nobleman's indiscretion could be excused as vigorous temperament, a woman's could be punished with exile, or worse. That didn't stop them. Many noblewomen mastered the art of looking holy while living wickedly. They went to confession daily, ensuring their sins never piled up too high, and dressed modestly in public, while hiding embroidered bodices beneath their cloaks. Behind every painted virgin on a palace wall, there was a story of guilt and hunger. And while the Vatican thundered about purity, Rome's noblewomen wrote sonnets about passion. They knew the game: sin quietly, repent beautifully, and never get caught. In a city where men wielded power in public, women learned to wield it in private. And often, their whispers in the dark echoed louder than any sermon from the pulpit. Art was Rome's most respectable disguise for desire. Beneath the halo of divine inspiration, painters and sculptors filled chapels with visions that were less about heaven and more about flesh. The Renaissance brought a revival of the human form, and artists embraced it with an enthusiasm that occasionally forgot where beauty ended and blasphemy began. Take Raphael, Rome's golden boy. His frescoes glowed with serenity, but behind the serenity lay a man famously incapable of resisting temptation. His muse, La Fornarina, was a baker's daughter whose curves inspired half his Madonnas. She became his obsession, his hidden partner, and, depending on who you asked, the true model for the Virgin Mary herself. When Raphael died young, rumours spread that it wasn't from fever but from exhaustion after a night of overzealous artistic study. Michelangelo, in contrast, wrestled with guilt as much as marble. His figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling were technically biblical, but no one could miss how lovingly he sculpted every muscle and curve. Some church officials grumbled that his saints looked a bit too human. Michelangelo's defenders called it divine anatomy. His critics called it pornography. The man himself prayed, sculpted, and agonized, torn between devotion and the undeniable beauty of the body. And then came the real rebels, Caravaggio chief among them. His art glowed with divine light but dripped with human vice. His models were often prostitutes and thieves pulled straight from the streets, their raw sensuality painted onto the faces of saints and martyrs. To him, holiness and sin were inseparable twins. His Judith beheading Holofernes was painted with such violence and erotic tension that viewers couldn't decide whether to cross themselves or look away. For every sacred commission, there was an unholy inspiration. Artists were paid by the church to glorify God, but in doing so, they also glorified the human body, the very thing the church warned against. Their studios were confessionals with paint and skin instead of rosaries. In Renaissance Rome, art wasn't just decoration. It was temptation made visible. Each brushstroke was a gamble between salvation and scandal. And as frescoes bloomed across the city's walls, so too did the rumour that God's greatest masterpiece was not the soul, but the naked human form. If you wanted to glimpse the true soul of Renaissance Rome, not the marble statues or papal decrees, but the pulsing, laughing, sinful heart, you went during Carnival. For a few days each year, Rome forgot its morals and remembered its appetites. Masks hid faces, wine replaced sermons, and the line between priest and peasant vanished under the glitter of torchlight. During Carnival, even the church relaxed its grip. Cardinals attended masquerades to observe the youth, which usually meant chasing dancers until dawn. Monks wandered the streets drunk on spiced wine, quoting scripture with the confidence of men who hadn't read it recently. Even the Pope, safely behind Vatican walls, was said to peer from balconies, amused by his city's annual descent into chaos. The streets overflowed with symbolism and sin. Floats carried allegories of virtue defeating vice, though most spectators rooted for vice. Courtesans disguised themselves as nuns. Nuns disguised themselves as courtesans, and both seemed to enjoy the confusion. Confessionals filled up the next week, priests shaking their heads solemnly while taking careful notes on who had done what with whom, and what of those confessions. They became Rome's unofficial gossip network. A penitent might confess her affair with a married cardinal, only to find her sins recited back to her later by a smirking servant. Secrets had a short lifespan in the Eternal City. One monk even joked that in Rome the Holy Spirit didn't descend as a dove, it arrived as a rumour. The contradiction was spectacular. Sin was punished and celebrated at once. Carnival parades passed beneath frescoes of the Last Judgment. The same hands that tossed roses into the crowd clasped rosaries the next morning. The faithful blamed human weakness, as though weakness were the city's favourite sport. When the festivities ended, Rome washed its face and put its halo back on. The priests thundered about virtue, the nobles returned to their marriages, and the streets smelled again of incense instead of sweat and wine. But the memory lingered. Behind every saintly procession was a hangover, and beneath every Ave Maria whispered in penance there lurked a quiet, knowing smile, because everyone in Rome understood one thing. Forgiveness came cheap, but the pleasures of sin were priceless. No discussion of Renaissance Rome's moral collapse would be complete without the Borgias, the family that turned sin into statecraft. If ordinary Romans gossiped about lust and greed, the Borgias patented it. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, ruled not like a shepherd of souls but like the godfather of an Italian crime syndicate, if the crime syndicate also issued indulgences. His Vatican was a stage for decadence. Witnesses spoke of banquets where courtesans dined naked, of rooms draped in silk and perfumed with scandal. One particularly infamous night, later dubbed the Banquet of Chestnuts, featured 50 dancers, cardinals tossing roasted chestnuts onto the floor, and guests crawling to collect them in a display of shameless indulgence. Whether the story was exaggerated hardly mattered. Rome believed it, and that was enough. Rodrigo's children were the real proof of his dual legacy. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's favoured son, was charming, handsome, and entirely ruthless. He murdered rivals with the same efficiency his father used to grant pardons. Cesare's sister, Lucretia, became a legend of her own, accused of incest, poisonings, and seductions, though much of it was likely propaganda spread by enemies. Still, her ability to manipulate the men around her, husbands, lovers, even popes, made her one of the most dangerous women in Europe. The Borgias blurred every line between holiness and hedonism. Their private vices spilled into public policy. Cardinals were appointed through bribery, sins were forgiven for gold, and marriage alliances were sealed with sheets instead of signatures. Rome had seen corrupt popes before, but never one who treated the papacy like a family business. Yet, in their defence, the Borgias were simply more open about what everyone else was doing in secret. While other families hid their excess behind Latin sermons, the Borgias wore theirs proudly, gilded and perfumed. They transformed the Vatican into both a brothel and a battlefield, depending on the day. When Alexander VI finally died, ironically after a banquet, Rome sighed in relief, but also in admiration. He had been a sinner, yes, but an unforgettable one. His reign left the church stained, his name cursed, but his legend immortal. In Renaissance Rome, the Borgias proved a timeless truth. in the right hands, sin could be the ultimate power. For all its outrage and sermons, the Church in Renaissance Rome was not merely a victim of sin, it was its enabler. The hierarchy thundered against lust from the pulpit, but behind those marble walls, coin purses clinked louder than conscience. Every indulgence sold, every absolution granted, was part of a grand economy of forgiveness. You could sleep with your mistress, confess it the next morning, and walk out spiritually spotless, so long as your donation was generous. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was business. Sin, after all, was reliable income. The Vatican's coffers swelled with money from those seeking redemption for pleasures they fully intended to repeat. In a sense, the Church had turned desire into a subscription service. Sin, confess, pay, repeat. Even the printing of indulgence certificates became a thriving industry. Monks who should have been illuminating Bibles were instead tallying receipts. Cardinals owned vineyards, lent money, and maintained luxurious estates stocked with servants and lovers. One bishop famously had so many illegitimate children that locals nicknamed his palace the House of the Lord and his extended family. And yet, these same men presided over inquisitions and moral trials, condemning peasants for sins that were practically Vatican traditions. When voices of reform began to rise, monks whispering that the Church had lost its soul, they were silenced or exiled. It was dangerous to accuse God's representatives of acting like merchants. Still, rumours of papal indulgence and debauchery spread faster than any decree. Even the faithful began to smirk when priests warned against temptation. They'd seen too many sermons end at the local tavern. The irony was divine. The more the Church preached against sin, the more it depended on it. Without lust, greed, and guilt, half of Rome's economy, and the other half of the Vatican's, would collapse overnight. Some tried to reform the system from within. A few honest friars denounced the corruption, only to be ignored, reassigned, or mysteriously found ill. Others simply accepted that Rome's holiness was theoretical at best. As one weary priest wrote in his diary, "We do not live in the city of God, but in the city God pretends not to see." And so, under 1,000 candles and painted saints, the Church continued its divine performance, half prayer, half indulgence, wholly human. By the end of the Renaissance, Rome had perfected the art of pretending to be holy. Every street corner boasted a shrine, every family a confessor, and every sinner a polished excuse. Virtue was no longer a condition of the soul, it was a costume. The city wore it proudly, stitched with silk, pearls, and just enough incense to mask the stench of hypocrisy. Men strutted into church with prayer books in one hand and love letters in the other. Women crossed themselves at Mass while discreetly meeting their lovers' eyes 2 pews away. Artists painted angels with the faces of their muses. Popes commissioned altarpieces to atone for the feasts they'd hosted the night before. Everyone in Rome was a performer, and the theatre was divine. The clever ones understood the game. You didn't have to be virtuous, you just had to look virtuous. A tear at confession, a generous donation to the poor, a pious expression when someone mentioned sin. Reputation was the currency of the city, and everyone guarded theirs with more care than their soul. If you sinned discreetly, you were human. If you were caught, you were damned. Even morality itself became fashionable. Religious relics were traded like jewellery, pilgrimages became social events, and charity was the Renaissance version of public relations. When noblemen sponsored new churches, it wasn't for salvation, it was for status. A fresco of the Last Judgment could cleanse your legacy faster than 1,000 prayers. The Vatican called it faith, Rome called it strategy. And yet, amid all this duplicity, there was something almost poetic. The city was corrupt, yes, but alive. Passion and hypocrisy danced together in perfect rhythm, giving birth to art, architecture, and ideas that still captivate the world. For every sin whispered in the dark, a masterpiece was born in the light. In the end, Renaissance Rome was not simply wicked, it was human. It showed the world that the holiest men could desire, that the most pious women could dream, and that beauty could grow from the soil of corruption. The Eternal City survived its scandals because deep down it never sought perfection. It sought immortality. And in that pursuit, even sin became sacred. You weren't born into fame. You were born into dust and horse sweat. The stables were your cradle, the sound of hooves your lullaby. In the Roman world, charioteers didn't come from noble bloodlines. They came from chains. Most aurigae were slaves, prisoners of war, or poor freedmen with more scars than coins. But that didn't matter. Because in the Circus Maximus, even a slave could become a god, if he survived long enough to cross the finish line. From the moment you could walk, you learned to run alongside the horses. They were your only teachers, impatient, powerful, and merciless. The trainers barked orders, whipped reins, and told you the truth every boy dreaded to hear. The sand will drink your blood before the crowd ever remembers your name. But you didn't listen. You had a hunger sharper than fear. Every morning began before dawn. You'd shovel dung, brush manes, and carry buckets until your arms trembled. And when the trainers weren't looking, you'd sneak into the empty track, feeling the silence of the circus as if it were watching you. You'd imagine the stands filled with thousands of Romans, cheering, jeering, wagering everything they owned on your death or victory. It wasn't faith that kept you going. It was pride. Pride and the dream that, for a few blazing minutes, all of Rome would see you. The Circus Maximus was the beating heart of the empire, more powerful than any temple, louder than any Senate debate. 200,000 spectators, their voices thundering through the marble seats. Men screamed, women fainted, and fortunes were won or lost in the time it took to complete 7 laps. No other stage offered such madness, or such glory. At night, you'd lie awake in the stables, staring at the oil lamps flickering against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, the noblemen slept in villas. But here, among the smell of straw and sweat, heroes were made. You didn't know if you'd die beneath the hooves or rise above them. You only knew one thing. One day, they'd chant your name. Not as a slave, not as a servant, but as the master of the circus, the charioteer who tamed the storm. The stables were your world, hot, noisy, and always one mistake away from death. You served the factions, the racing teams of Rome, each as fierce as a legion. There were the blues and greens, the reds and whites, 4 colours that divided the empire more passionately than politics or war. Every Roman had a side, from slaves in the taverns to senators in togas. The circus wasn't just entertainment, it was religion. And you were about to be its priest. You began as a stable boy, a shadow among giants. You brushed horses until your hands blistered, fed them barley mixed with wine, and learned to read their moods the way a soldier reads an enemy. These weren't ordinary beasts. They were athletes, warriors in harness, Spanish stallions, Nubian mares, Cappadocian chargers, creatures so expensive that emperors fought over them. They were sacred and savage in equal measure. But danger bred discipline. Rival factions sabotaged each other constantly. Buckles loosened, harnesses cut, feed poisoned. A single accident could end a career, or a life. You slept lightly, with one hand near your knife and the other over the reins. To protect the horses was to protect your future. The Dominus Factionis, your team master, ruled the stables with an iron whip. He taught you that trust was weakness and hesitation was death. He'd slap your shoulder and say, "If the horses don't fear you, boy, the crowd won't respect you." And yet, you couldn't rule by fear alone. You had to earn the horses' loyalty, their heartbeat syncing with yours when the chariot roared forward. That bond was your only armour. At night, the stables came alive with murmured prayers. Drivers traced charms on the horses' foreheads, invoking Neptune, god of horses and the sea. Others offered wine to Fortuna, the goddess of luck, because skill alone wasn't enough. One snapped axle, one loose strap, one heartbeat too late, and your body would be trampled into the sand before the crowd even gasped. Still, you stayed. You endured the heat, the sweat, and the constant risk. Because every lap around the circus promised something more intoxicating than freedom, immortality, and you were willing to burn in those stables until the gods noticed your fire. Your first day behind the reins wasn't a race. It was a battle against terror. The chariot was lighter than it looked, a fragile frame of wood and leather balanced on knife-thin wheels. One wrong move, one stumble from the horses, and you'd be dragged to your death before anyone could shout your name. The trainers called it learning. You called it surviving. Every sunrise meant drills. You learned to stand upright while the chariot rattled over uneven ground, the reins wrapped not in your hands but around your waist. That way, you could steer with your entire body, but if you fell, you'd be dragged until you were pulp. It was the first and cruelest lesson. Mastery and death used the same knots. The horses were your partners and your executioners. You memorized every snort, twitch, and tremor. 4 horses, 1 mind. That was the goal. If one faltered, the others followed. If one bolted, all were doomed. You learned to whisper to them, to curse them, to pray with them. Their eyes, white with fire and fear, reflected your own. You didn't control them, you became them. Trainers barked insults, flung whips, and hurled amphorae when you failed. One old veteran, half deaf, half mad, told you that a true Origa never blinks during a crash. You'll see splinters fly, blood spray, skulls crack, he said. But if you blink, boy, you'll miss your moment to live. He wasn't wrong. To simulate the circus, they'd unleash you into mock races, dust, shouts, and chaos. Rivals slammed into your chariot wheels, trying to splinter them. You learned to swing your whip not just at the horses, but at other drivers, striking their arms or faces. There were no rules in training because there were none in the arena. Survival was the lesson. By dusk, your muscles screamed, your hands bled, and your heart beat like a drum of war. But pain dulled, and something colder replaced it. A strange calm. You realized that fear was useless. The sand didn't care who lived or died. It only remembered who left their mark. That night, you fell asleep among the horses, your fingers still gripping an imaginary rein. You dreamed of thunder, hooves, wheels, and a crowd chanting a name you swore would soon be yours. The first time you entered the Circus Maximus, you didn't breathe. You shook. The noise alone could kill a man. 200,000 Romans roared like an ocean, their cheers rolling off the stone seats in waves. Trumpets blared, banners rippled, and the smell of sweat, dust, and roasted meat filled the air. It wasn't just a race. It was religion in motion. The gods of Rome were watching, and so was every gambler, thief, senator, and slave in the empire. You took your place in the starting gates, the carceres, where 8 chariots lined up like loaded arrows. The horses were wild, nostrils flaring, hooves clawing at the sand. You whispered their names like a prayer: Aquila, Nero, Pallas, and Flame, and tightened the reins around your waist. Across the track, the opposing factions glared. The Greens were favoured today, and the Blues, your team, were desperate for a win. The betters had already decided who should live and who should die. You just had to prove them wrong. The official dropped his cloth. A heartbeat of silence, and then chaos. The gates exploded open, and 8 chariots surged forward like unleashed gods. Sand flew, wheels screamed, and you leaned into the turn, your entire life balanced on 2 spinning wooden circles. The first corner was a battlefield. Drivers whipped their rivals, horses screamed, and the crowd howled for blood. You felt the jolt as a rival slammed into your wheel, trying to shatter it. You countered, guiding your team tighter around the spinner, the central barrier lined with statues of Neptune and dolphins. You brushed past them so close that salt water from the fountain splashed your arm. 1 lap down, 6 to go. The crowd's roar became rhythm, each cheer a drumbeat in your chest. You could feel their eyes on you, thousands of strangers whose love or hate depended on a single turn. For a fleeting moment you understood why men risked everything for this madness. Death didn't frighten you anymore, it thrilled you. When you crossed the line, you didn't know if you'd won or survived. The sand clung to your face like ashes, and your hands shook from the strain. But above the chaos, one thing was clear. The crowd was chanting. Maybe not loudly, not yet, but you heard it. Your name, and it was only the beginning. Victory in the circus was intoxicating, louder than thunder, sweeter than wine. When you won, the crowd's roar swallowed you whole. Women tossed garlands, gamblers wept with joy, and the emperor himself might nod in approval. You'd return to the stables like a conquering general, your horses steaming with sweat and pride. For a slave or freedman, no triumph in Rome compared. In a single afternoon, you could earn what a soldier made in 10 years, and with victory came everything else. Fame, gold, desire. Patrons lined up to sponsor you, politicians sought your friendship, and poets immortalized your name on wax tablets. The city whispered about your skill, your luck, your supposed charm. Even noble women, bored of marble husbands and arranged dinners, sent you secret messages. To Rome, you were no longer a man. You were a myth with a pulse. But the higher you rose, the sharper the knives became. Jealousy was the second language of the circus. Rivals plotted accidents, fans rioted if their colour lost, and the same crowd that cheered you today would curse your name tomorrow. You learned to smile carefully and sleep lightly. Glory had a smell, and so did betrayal. Your winnings bought freedom from your master, but not from danger. Free men could race under their own name, and many did, until they died tangled in reins or crushed beneath horses. Statues were built for the lucky ones, but most orage ended up broken, their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. Every lap you raced was a wager against the gods, and they rarely paid twice. And yet, no gold or safety could match the feeling of standing before the crowd. Your hand raised in victory, the laurel crown pressed against your hair. You'd look up at the marble stands, see the nobles who once ignored you, and feel their envy like sunlight. For a few stolen moments, you weren't a slave or a mortal, you were the pulse of Rome itself. Then you'd leave the track, still trembling from the speed, knowing that tomorrow could end it all. But as you brushed your horses and cleaned the dust from their manes, you whispered the same vow every charioteer made. Let me die fast, but let me die famous. Rome's heart didn't beat for emperors or legions, it beat for colours. Blue versus green, red versus white. These weren't just racing teams. They were tribes, cults, armies of passion that divided neighbourhoods and toppled reason. The city's loyalty was painted in pigments. A man might forgive an insult to his mother, but never to his faction. As a driver for the Blues, you wore their colour like armour. To the faithful, you were a hero. To the Greens, you were the enemy. Fans scrawled your name on tavern walls, sang songs about your victories, and started brawls over your honour. When you passed through the markets, mothers pointed you out to their sons. But you also learned to travel with a cloak pulled low, because in the wrong part of town, admiration could turn into assassination. The factions were more than sport. They were politics. Senators funded teams, emperors played favourites, and riots flared when races turned bloody. The Circus Maximus had its own kind of war diplomacy. A sabotaged wheel could spark street battles. A disputed victory could burn a district. When the Greens accused your faction of bribing an official, the city erupted. By nightfall, torches lit the forum, and the Tiber ran red with faction blood. Even the emperors feared the factions. They weren't mere fans. They were Rome's other army. Charioteers like you held the power to calm or ignite them. Once, after a string of your victories, the emperor himself invited you to dine in his palace. Not out of admiration, out of caution. He wanted to be sure your fame served the throne, not threatened it. You smiled, bowed, and toasted to Rome, pretending you didn't notice his guards tightening their grips. But among the rivalries, there was one face that haunted you, your counterpart in green, a charioteer named Felix. He was fast, brutal, and fearless. The crowd called him the Serpent. Each race between you wasn't a contest. It was war. You'd meet eyes at the starting line, each knowing only one would leave the circus alive that day. The colours, the cheers, the glory, it was all blood and illusion. Rome didn't love its heroes, it devoured them. And as long as the crowd demanded danger, the circus would feed them. One crash, one corpse, one colour at a time. The circus was beautiful from the stands, but from the chariot it was a slaughterhouse. Death came quick, loud, and merciless. One snapped wheel, one frightened horse, and you were done. The Romans even had a word for it, naufragium, a shipwreck, because that's what a crash looked like. Wood splintering like waves, bodies flung into the air, and screams swallowed by the crowd's roar. You saw your first one at 16. The driver ahead of you misjudged the turn around the Spina. His wheel clipped the barrier, shattered, and sent his chariot spinning. The horses panicked, dragging him by the reins as his body bounced across the sand like a broken doll. You smelled the blood before you saw it. The crowd erupted, not in horror, but in ecstasy. Death was their favourite finish line. Every race was a gamble with fate. You learned to watch for the warning signs, the flicker in a horse's gait, the wobble of a rival's wheel, the tension in the reins. You trained yourself to react faster than thought, to steer by instinct when reason would freeze. The circus punished hesitation. A good charioteer died quick. A great one learned to make death his ally. The crashes were worse near the meta, the turning posts. Drivers fought for the inside lane, where victory lived and disaster waited. You hugged the curve so tight you could feel the marble scrape your axle. Too wide, and you'd lose the race. Too tight, and you'd join the wreckage. There was no in-between, only glory or ruin. Sometimes, when a crash happened behind you, the screams faded beneath the pounding of hooves. You never looked back. To survive, you had to be ruthless. Compassion was for poets and priests, not for men who raced the gods. You told yourself each crash was another sacrifice to Neptune, god of horses, and whispered a prayer that it would never be your turn. But every driver knew the truth. Luck was a rope that always frayed. One day, you'd feel it snap. And when it did, the circus would keep roaring, the crowd would keep cheering, and Rome would move on, its appetite for blood as endless as its thirst for speed. If death was always one turn away, fortune sat in the other. For the few who survived long enough, chariot racing was the quickest road from slavery to staggering wealth. Rome adored its winners with the same frenzy it used to crucify its losers. You began as property, but with every victory you became something rarer, a man who owned his fate. Your winnings grew faster than the crowds could shout your name. Bags of silver, laurel crowns, fine cloaks and golden goblets, spoils once reserved for generals, were yours. You bought your freedom first, then your house, then horses of your own. Men who once spat at your feet now bowed when you entered the tavern. Senators nodded to you in the forum, pretending they didn't remember your slave brand. You smiled, because you knew they did. Women followed too, some for love, most for legend. Courtesans, noble widows, even priestesses found reasons to pray with you. Fame turned everything you touched to excess. Banquets lasted until dawn, your name echoing in drunken toasts. You spent money like sand through your fingers because the gods had made you fast, but not immortal. And yet, the higher you climbed, the lonelier the air became. Friends became flatterers, admirers became thieves. You learned that Rome didn't love you, it loved the myth of you, the man who cheated death, who tamed thunder, who could make the city forget its hunger for one glorious afternoon. Still, you couldn't stop. Fortune was a fever you couldn't shake. The circus was your temple, and each race another prayer to keep your luck alive. You invested in your own team, hired grooms, even trained younger drivers. Some called you Dominus Orige, Lord of the Charioteers. It sounded noble, but you knew better. Beneath the gold and applause, the same truth burned. Your empire rested on spinning wheels and frightened horses. At feasts, poets recited your name beside Hercules and Achilles. You laughed, but deep down the comparison chilled you. Heroes never lived long in Rome. They burned bright, then vanished. And you knew that one day, whether by age, accident, or envy, the circus would take back everything it had given. Fortune was generous, but she always collected her debts. Time caught every charioteer, no matter how fast his horses ran. Your hands, once strong enough to tame a team of stallions, began to tremble when you held the reins. The cheers that once lifted your soul now felt distant, as if muffled behind the roar of memory. You told yourself you'd retire after one more race, but the circus had a way of whispering, "Just one more." The younger drivers were faster now, reckless boys who raced as you once had, with no thought of survival. They called you veteranus, half in respect, half in pity. You watched them train and saw your own ghost in their eyes, hungry, fearless, doomed. The track hadn't changed, but you had. The same sand that once promised immortality now waited to swallow you. Still, the itch returned every morning. You couldn't ignore the sound of wheels rattling, the thunder of hooves, the intoxicating pull of danger. So you strapped the reins around your waist one last time and stepped into the sunlight. The crowd erupted, not out of routine, but out of recognition. You were legend now, a living relic of the golden years. The gates opened. The horses lunged forward, and for a heartbeat you felt 20 again. The wind tore at your tunic, sand stung your face, and your pulse matched the pounding of hooves. You hugged the meta tighter than you should have, pride overriding sense. Behind you, a rival's wheel clipped your axle. You felt the jolt, the violent shudder, the whisper of fate. Then silence. For a heartbeat, everything slowed. The sunlight on the marble statues, the hiss of the crowd's breath, the moment before the crash. You didn't pray. You just smiled. You had always known the circus would take you this way. When the wreck came, the crowd roared, not in grief, but in awe. They said the horses ran 3 more laps before stopping, that the sand turned crimson beneath them. They carried your broken body from the track, draped in the blue colours of your faction, and buried you beneath a small monument outside the city walls. The inscription read, "He rode with the gods. He fell like a storm. And somewhere beyond the roar of the circus, you still race, forever chasing the thunder." Long before the pyramids pierced the horizon or temples echoed with hymns to Ra, the true lifeline of Egypt was already at work, the Nile. It wasn't just a river, it was an engineer of worlds, carving life out of desolation. Each year, like clockwork, it rose from the heart of Africa, swelling with the rains of distant lands and spilling its gift across the parched valleys of Egypt. When the waters came, they brought silt, rich, dark, and miraculous. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing more than a kingdom of dust and wind. To the Egyptians, the flood wasn't a natural event. It was divine rhythm. They didn't just watch the river. They listened to it. The rise of the water meant rebirth, and its retreat meant the beginning of the harvest. Every life, from the poorest farmer to the most powerful pharaoh, depended on that pulse. The entire calendar revolved around it. 3 sacred seasons: Akhet, the flooding; Pere, the growing; and Shemu, the harvest. The Nile was time itself, a living clock that set the pace of eternity. But the river was unpredictable. Some years it rose too high, drowning fields and villages. Other years it failed to flood at all, leaving famine in its wake. So the Egyptians did what humans always do when faced with the whims of nature. They learned to shape it. They measured its depths with nilometers carved into temple stones, recorded its moods, and built a science around its behaviour. Over generations, they transformed a wild river into a precision instrument. When the floodwaters began to recede, the people moved quickly, digging canals and reservoirs to trap what remained. Each family took up its part in this yearly ritual, turning mud and water into order. What began as survival evolved into mastery. Egypt didn't just live by the Nile, it engineered it. In the shimmer of its waters, civilization found its reflection. The river connected gods to men, priests to peasants, life to death. Its banks became the stage where humanity learned that control over nature was not about domination. It was about harmony. The Nile didn't belong to Egypt. Egypt belonged to the Nile, and it would keep shaping her destiny for thousands of years. When the Nile rose, Egypt held its breath. The flood was both miracle and menace, a blessing that could easily turn to ruin. For centuries, survival meant predicting the river's moods, and so the Egyptians became mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers long before the words existed. They measured the world not by stars or empires, but by water. The priests of Heliopolis watched the sky, marking the annual rising of the star Sirius, Sopdet, which heralded the coming flood. Its appearance in the dawn sky was no superstition. It was a signal from the heavens that the Nile was on its way. Villagers would cheer when they saw it, because it meant life had been renewed. But predicting the flood was only half the battle. Controlling it was the real test. Along the riverbanks, workers dug canals that stretched for miles, guiding the waters into basins and channels. With wooden shovels and stone picks, they carved Egypt's first arteries of irrigation. The engineers divided the land into fields, bordered by low earthen walls that trapped the floodwater and let it soak slowly into the soil. When the waters withdrew, they left behind perfect moisture for planting barley, flax, and wheat. This wasn't chaos, it was geometry. The fields were measured with precision, each plot mapped and taxed according to its fertility. Surveyors, called rope stretchers, walked the land after every flood to redraw boundaries washed away by the current. Their ropes weren't just tools, they were the birth of mathematics itself, but nature never fully obeyed. When the river failed to rise, drought devoured everything. When it flooded too high, entire villages vanished under the surge. To tame it, the Egyptians built dikes and embankments, sometimes even small dams of stone and mud. These works required not just muscle, but unity, a society that could move tens of thousands of men with a single command. The Nile wasn't merely a source of food, it was a proving ground for organization, labor, and genius. It demanded constant vigilance and rewarded discipline. Over generations, Egypt learned the art of cooperation through water. And as the river obeyed, it taught its people something timeless. That civilization is not built by conquest, but by rhythm, by mastering the flood without defying it. To the ancient Egyptians, time itself flowed from the Nile. The river's pulse shaped the calendar, the rituals, even the emotions of an entire civilization. While other cultures marked the years by the movement of kings or the whims of war, Egypt measured existence by the rise and fall of the water. Every year was a cycle of death, rebirth, and harvest, played out not in temples or palaces, but in the river's current. The Egyptians divided their year into 3 great seasons. Akhet, the inundation, when the floods swallowed the fields. Pere, the growing season, when crops sprouted from the black silt. And Shemu, the harvest, when the earth gave back what the Nile had promised. Each season lasted 4 months, each month 30 days, plus a handful of festival days added to please the gods and balance the cosmic order. The rhythm was mathematical, but its meaning was spiritual. When the star, Sopdet, Sirius, rose in the eastern sky just before dawn, it signaled the start of Akhet. Priests at temples along the river watched for it with sacred precision. They believed this shining herald was the goddess of the flood herself, her light awakening the sleeping Nile. It was the Egyptians' first astronomical prediction, a cosmic calendar that united heaven, earth, and water. Every village had its rituals to welcome the flood. Farmers sang to Hapi, the god of the Nile, offering bread and beer to ensure the waters rose just enough. Not too little to starve them, not too high to drown their homes. The flood's arrival wasn't just anticipated, it was celebrated like the return of a god. The flood calendar gave the Egyptians something no other early civilization possessed: predictability. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to store grain. The Nile turned chaos into order, nature into schedule, survival into tradition. Time, once wild and unknowable, now ticked with the certainty of a clock made of water. In the world beyond Egypt, seasons meant fear. But here, the people of the Nile faced the future with calm. They didn't resist the river's rhythm, they lived by it. In its steady heartbeat, they found eternity, measured not in years or rains, but in floods. The Egyptians didn't just wait for the Nile, they shaped it. Every canal, basin and reservoir was a thread in the grand tapestry of an engineered landscape. The early pharaohs understood that whoever controlled the water controlled the kingdom. Power flowed through ditches and dikes as surely as it did through thrones and crowns. The first canal builders were visionaries with shovels. Using only simple tools, wooden ploughs, baskets and copper adzes, they redirected the river's flow, carving channels through the desert like veins through a body. These canals turned the unpredictable flood into a predictable harvest, guiding water to fields miles from the main riverbanks. With every project, Egypt became less at the mercy of the Nile's moods and more the master of its rhythm. By the Old Kingdom, irrigation had become a state enterprise. Thousands of labourers worked under the watch of engineers and scribes, each basin measured and recorded. Canals weren't just practical, they were political. When a pharaoh ordered a new network of waterways, it wasn't only to feed his people, it was to prove his divine authority. The god-king didn't simply pray for floods, he commanded them. One of the earliest great works was said to be the Bar Yusuf, the Canal of Joseph. Whether myth or memory, it carried water from the Nile to the Fayum Depression, turning a barren basin into Egypt's oldest reclaimed farmland. Centuries later, it would still feed villages, a living monument to ancient hydrology. Even desert towns were bound by the flow. Irrigation transformed their economies and their loyalties. A canal that ran dry could ruin a province, while a well-timed diversion could spark a new settlement. Water became currency, and the pharaoh was its banker. Scribes documented every drop, carving tallies onto papyrus and temple walls. But canals also united Egypt. They became highways for trade, ferrying goods, ideas, and people between distant regions. The same water that grew wheat in the south carried granite for pyramids in the north. The Nile's veins stitched the nation together. Each channel was a statement of intent. Man cooperating with nature, not conquering it. Egypt's greatness didn't rise from conquest or gold. It flowed quietly in irrigation trenches, where sweat and engineering transformed survival into civilization. Behind every monument, every harvest, and every floodgate stood a quiet army of minds. The engineers, surveyors, and scribes who turned water into order. They weren't poets or warriors, but Egypt owed them everything. Without them, the Nile's blessings would have drowned or starved the land. With them, it became the most productive river valley on earth. The shaduf, a simple counterweighted lever, was one of their earliest triumphs. With it, a single farmer could lift buckets of water from canal to field, feeding crops by hand when the floodwaters had retreated. Later, the sakia, a water wheel powered by oxen, multiplied that effort. What began as manual toil evolved into mechanical rhythm. Egypt's first machines born from necessity, not luxury. But the real geniuses were the surveyors, known as the rope stretchers. After every flood, when boundaries vanished beneath the silt, they paced the fields with knotted cords, measuring anew. Their work wasn't guesswork, it was geometry. Angles, distances, and proportions were the tools of empire. The knowledge they gathered shaped both the fields and the foundations of temples and tombs. From water levels came symmetry, and from symmetry, civilization. Then came the scribes, the record keepers of the flood. They tracked water heights with nilometers, stone pillars marked with carved cubits, stationed at temples like Elephantine and Philae. These sacred gauges transformed a natural event into data. When the water rose higher than expected, they warned the farmers. When it fell too low, they prepared for famine. The priests interpreted the numbers as divine messages, but the engineers knew they were simply reading the river's pulse. Even the pharaohs relied on these calculations. A misjudged flood meant not just hunger, but revolt. The engineers were, in a sense, guardians of stability. Their success was invisible, their failure catastrophic. They didn't wear crowns, but they held the kingdom together. Every brick of the pyramids, every loaf of bread in a worker's hands, began with their measurements. They bridged the gap between gods and men, between chaos and control. Their mathematics flowed downstream into the very structure of Egypt itself. In a world ruled by divine order, they were the quiet priests of precision, the architects not of temples, but of life. To the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't a river, it was a living god. Its floods were divine moods, its currents sacred speech. They called it Hapi, the bringer of abundance, the lord of fish and grain, the blue-skinned deity whose body ran through the veins of Egypt itself. Every drop of water was his blessing, and every drought his silence. When the flood came each year, priests led ceremonies at the riverbanks. Offerings of bread, beer, and flowers floated downstream, meant to please Hapi and coax him into generosity. In the temples of Thebes and Memphis, hymns were sung not to conquerors or kings, but to the river that sustained them all. "You flood the fields," they chanted. "You give life to all that lives. You are the god of bread." The flood wasn't chaos. It was divine order in motion, a proof that Ma'at, the universal balance, still governed the world. If the waters rose too high or too low, it was a warning that harmony had been broken. The pharaoh, as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, carried the sacred duty of maintaining that balance. When the Nile failed, so did his legitimacy. The river wasn't just water, it was politics, theology, and prophecy woven together. Yet the Egyptians didn't fear the Nile the way others feared their gods. They revered it with familiarity, almost tenderness. They painted Hapi as neither male nor female, but both, fertile, round-bellied, generous. He symbolized abundance without violence, creation without conquest. Even death was tied to his gift. When the flood receded, the rich black silt it left behind was called Kemet, the Black Land. It was from this word that Egypt took its ancient name. Festivals marked the inundation's arrival like the dawn of a new year. Children danced in the streets, farmers sang as they repaired their dikes, and priests announced the rising waters with drums and incense. For a few precious weeks, Egypt was united, not by ruler or war, but by water. The Nile's rhythm wasn't simply agricultural, it was spiritual architecture. Each rise and fall was a heartbeat in the body of a god, and through that god, Egypt found immortality. Empires would rise and crumble, but as long as Hapi returned, life and faith would begin again. Every summer, as the Nile's floodwaters spread across Egypt, they carried a silent gift, fine, black silt. To the Egyptians, this was not mere mud. It was the river's voice, the language of creation itself. When the waters withdrew, they left behind a thin, glistening layer of life, rich with minerals from mountains far to the south. This black soil, Kemet, was the difference between feast and famine, between civilization and sand. The farmers knew its texture by touch alone. A handful of Nile silt, smooth and dark, was worth more than gold. It grew wheat, barley, flax, papyrus, everything that fed both body and empire. Each family had its plot, marked by ridges of earth that trapped the water. Once the floods receded, oxen ploughed the damp fields, and workers cast seeds into the gleaming mud. Within weeks, the land erupted into green, a miracle so regular it felt divine. Scribes recorded each year's yield, comparing it to the height of the flood. From these notes, patterns emerged. Low floods meant thin harvests and rising grain prices. Generous floods meant surplus and stability. Over centuries, this quiet observation became science. Egyptian farmers didn't just plant, they forecasted. They learned to listen to the silt, to read its weight, colour, and spread. The texture of the soil even shaped Egypt's cities. Villages rose on higher ground to escape the floods, while fields stretched in long ribbons along the riverbanks. The narrow green valley, hemmed in by desert, created a sense of focus, a civilization perfectly balanced between chaos and order. Each year, the Nile erased and redrew the landscape, forcing Egypt to adapt, to rebuild, to remember. In a way, the flood wrote history. Temples and tombs were built of limestone, but the foundation of Egypt's story was mud, wet, black, eternal. Even the pigment on their frescoes came from the same silt that nourished their crops. The Nile wasn't just feeding Egypt, it was painting it. When foreigners saw the river's bounty, they envied its magic. But to the Egyptians, there was nothing supernatural about it. It was partnership, not miracle. The Nile gave, and they listened. The silt was the handwriting of the gods, and Egypt learned to read it fluently, year after year. Controlling the Nile's gift required more than reverence. It demanded precision. The Egyptians turned their worship into engineering, transforming the natural flood into a system of managed abundance. What began as simple canals grew into a network of hydraulic machinery that stretched from the delta to Nubia. It was a living circuit, where every basin, dike, and channel played its part in Egypt's grand equation of survival. At the heart of this system were the basin fields, vast rectangular enclosures bordered by earthen embankments. When the floodwaters rose, the channels filled these basins in careful sequence. Water lingered for weeks, soaking the soil, before being drained into the next enclosure. The process mimicked the river's natural flow, but under human command. The result was controlled fertility, a man-made imitation of the Nile's pulse. Lifting water was the next challenge. The shaduf, a counterbalanced lever with a bucket at one end and a weight at the other, revolutionized irrigation. With it, a single farmer could raise hundreds of litres of water a day from canals to higher terraces. Later came the sakia, a wooden wheel turned by oxen, its pots scooping and pouring in endless rhythm. These devices were simple but brilliant, powered by muscle and geometry rather than magic. Every flood season required coordination on a national scale. Labourers repaired dikes and dredged canals under orders from local governors, who reported to royal engineers in Memphis. The pharaoh's decrees flowed downstream like the water itself, ensuring that every village along the river contributed to the balance. A breach in one province could doom another hundreds of miles away. Even temples were part of the system. Priests used nilometers, vertical shafts with carved cubit marks, to measure water levels. From these readings, they could predict crop yields, tax revenues, and the empire's stability for the year ahead. Science, religion, and politics converged at the waterline. The Nile's machinery wasn't made of bronze or stone. It was made of people. Tens of thousands worked in synchrony, guided by the river's tempo. Egypt's true marvel wasn't a pyramid or a sphinx. It was this invisible infrastructure, a civilization built not to fight nature, but to think like it. The flood was eternal, but so was their genius in mastering it. Long after the pharaohs were gone, and their temples swallowed by sand, the Nile kept its rhythm. The same flood that carried papyrus boats and golden barges in the time of Ramses still rose and fell centuries later, watched by farmers who no longer knew the names of the gods, but still depended on their river's mercy. Egypt's monuments weathered and crumbled, yet its greatest creation, the harnessing of water, never stopped working. The techniques that once fed the pyramids' builders became templates for civilizations that followed. Greek engineers studied Egyptian canals. Roman surveyors borrowed their measuring cords. Medieval farmers across the Mediterranean used shadufs and sakia wheels, almost unchanged. Even the word nilometer, survived as a concept long after its readings were carved in cubits. Egypt had turned the simple act of irrigation into a science, and the world never forgot the lesson. But the Nile's power was always double-edged. Too much control, and the river withered. Too little, and chaos returned. Later, rulers tried to command it the way the pharaohs had, with bureaucracy instead of divinity. But the balance was delicate. The British, centuries later, would build dams to regulate its floods, continuing a dialogue that began thousands of years before with baskets of mud and stone embankments. Even modern engineers in Cairo, studying satellite data and water flow, are heirs to those ancient surveyors who measured with ropes and stars. The true legacy of the Nile isn't in monuments or myths, it's in mindset. The Egyptians learned early that mastery of nature doesn't come through conquest, but through rhythm. They treated the flood not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a partner to be understood. Their success was measured not in conquests, but in continuity, the ability to keep life flowing year after year, generation after generation. Every civilization dreams of eternity. Egypt quietly achieved it through water. The same patterns of canals, crops, and villages seen from the sky today mirror those etched into tomb walls 3,000 years ago. The Nile still flows north, still leaves its mark in silt and shadow, still murmurs the same ancient promise: "Follow my rhythm, and I will make you eternal." In the end, Egypt's greatest monument wasn't carved from stone. It was engineered from the river itself.